today's Scott Madden Energy Industry Update webcast, King for a Day, hosted by Energy Central. And I'd like to hand the floor over to Kristen Lyons, partner and energy practice leader with Scott Madden, to kick things off. Kristen, welcome to the event. You have the floor.
Thanks, PJ. It's great to be back with you again today. Next slide, please. And next slide. So briefly, Scott Madden is a general management consulting firm specializing in energy. Our areas of focus, as you can see here, are generation, transmission and distribution, grid edge, rates and regulatory, natural gas, and energy corporate services. We serve primarily electric and gas utilities and are spending much of our time these days on issues related to the clean energy transition. We publish the Energy Industry Update twice a year, and it highlights what we see as the most important issues in the industry. And in this edition, we contemplated what we might fix if we were king for a day. There are so many challenges facing the industry today, and frankly, many of them seem intractable. So wouldn't it be great if we could just remedy some of them overnight? So, as such, we're going to talk about three primary issues. First, large loads in the form of data centers, manufacturing, and crypto mining. Second, decarbonization and how that's evolving across the country in the form of clean heat. And last but not least, workforce development and what the workforce of today looks like and how it's evolving. Next slide, please. So to get us started with large loads, Gerardo Morales is going to lead the discussion. Gerardo is a partner with the firm. He joined us in 2013, and his areas of expertise include generation, including renewables, operations and maintenance, business planning, program project management, and org design, among others. Gerardo?
Thank you, Kristen. Next slide. And next slide. So as Kristen mentioned, there's been an unprecedented surge in electric load demand across the United States. And really the objective for our discussion today is really walk you through on what is going on when it comes in terms to this large loads topic, understand where is this happening across the nation, have a discussion around some of the key drivers and associated data that goes along with those key drivers, and then really wrap it up in a discussion around what has been the industry's reaction to deal with the large loads issue, as well as some key takeaways for the audience to consider moving forward. In terms of what's going on, this slide summarizes a little bit of what the current situation here. We've inserted a few quotes on the left-hand side of some of the key industry players that speak to the speed and scale of the large flows and the unprecedented surge of load demand across the United States. There's also some commentary around our ability to maintain our carbon-free or net zero targets pending this large increase in load demand. And then, of course, some general commentary around our ability as an industry to safely and reliably serve this load while maintaining our current trajectory and targets as an industry. The graph on the right really kind of paints the picture of what we're looking at here. If you look at NERC's projection over the last 5 years, we've seen an exponential increase in the projected demand from where we started 5 years ago to where we currently stand. And in summary, when comparing today's numbers with what these numbers looked like 5 years ago in terms of summer peak capacity and winter peak capacity, we can observe close to an 80% increase on summer peak demand and 122% increase in winter peak demand that really speaks to the volume and the change that we're experiencing as an industry to help manage some of the issues associated with large loads. So where's this happening? Let's go to the next slide. So this slide summarizes what are the greatest increases in projected demand by the year 2028 by major planning areas or regions across the nation. And what we can immediately see is that we're really dealing with an issue that has an impact across the nation. It's a nationwide issue, but it does have some regional elements or regional components that add another layer of complexity on how we view and analyze this problem. The first thing we want to point out is in the table that we have, a few numbers here that highlight what the changes in projected demand are. The second column outlined the forecast for year 2022. The third column outlined what the updated forecast for year 23 currently stand. And then the last two columns really summarize the delta between the 2 years in terms of capacity and percent increase. A few observations worth pointing out here to illustrate the regional component of this problem. First, if you look at, in no particular order, if you look at the southern region, when you aggregate the areas associated with North and South Carolina, Georgia, and the ERCOT market, you're looking at close to 51.6 of terawatt hours of additional capacity expected to come online by the year 2028. Another example is the Portland General Electric region, where we've observed close to a 21.2 increase in projected demand by the year 2028 up in the Pacific Northwest. And similar numbers are experienced in the Southwest region. When you aggregate what we're seeing in the Arizona Public Service, California market, and some of the markets served by the Southwestern Power Pool. And then last but not least, we have the Northeast region with primarily markets served by the PJM system operator, where we see some exponential numbers in terms of 35.2 terawatt hours of additional capacity expected to come online by the year 2028. So some pretty significant numbers across the board, but it does speak to the regional elements associated with the large loads. So what are some of the key drivers? So if we go to the next slide, Kristen briefly alluded to what we're considering some of the major drivers behind large loads. We've have them here categorized in three broad areas. First is new domestic manufacturing, largely driven by the computer, electronic, and electric manufacturing sectors. Some of the numbers that you see here below are associated with large manufacturing investments announcements in the United States associated with each of these sectors. So $235 billion in the semiconductor industry, $161 billion in the electric vehicle and battery sector, and then of course some pretty significant announcements in terms of investments associated with clean energy manufacturing, as well as the bio industry and heavy industry. The second category, I think, is everyone's favorite topic, is associated with data centers. For those that have been following the energy press closely and recently, I think there's a daily article published on the mainstream media that speaks to what the data centers are impacting in terms of our capacity to manage that load on the grid, as well as our ability to serve the load associated with these facilities. At a high level, we're expecting approximately 7 gigawatts of additional capacity associated with data centers to come online by the year 2030. There's already 23 gigawatts of capacity in operation in the United States, so some pretty staggering numbers. And then last but not least, we have the cryptocurrency mining category, which is coming to the forefront fairly recently, largely driven by the ban of the Chinese government of the cryptocurrency mining practices in the year 2021. Just to put it in perspective, just in a short period amount of time, some of the estimates account for cryptocurrency mining load anywhere between 0.6 to 0.3% of the total electric consumption in the United States when compared to the aggregate in general. So this summarizes our key drivers. So how do we know that these are the driving factors behind the large load? So if we go to the next slide, we'll start taking a deeper dive into each of these topics. And this is the new domestic manufacturing component of some of our key drivers. The first graph on the left-hand side really summarizes the total construction monthly spend in the United States over the last 20 years. And what is clear here that you can see a trend towards the latter end of this graph where there's a significant uptick in monthly construction spend in the United States. And really the trajectory over the last 10 to 15 years has hovered anywhere from between $50 million to $100 million in total monthly construction spend. And then if you compare those numbers to what we're recently seeing over the last 3 to 5 years, just to give you a sense of the scale, the total monthly construction spend for the month of January in 2020 was around $79 million. And for the month of November of 2023, that number went up to close to $214 million. So that represents approximately 170% increase in the total monthly construction spend. The graph on the right really provides the next layer of visibility on what's the driving factor behind this uptick in spend. As we discussed on the prior slide, it's pretty evident that the computer, electronic, and electrical sectors of the manufacturing industry are really the driving force behind this uptick in construction spend. Some of the key enablers for this are, of course, the onshoring interest that started to take place after the COVID pandemic. And then, of course, we had the CHIPS and Science Act that heavily targeted the semiconductor industry to bring some of the onshoring manufacturing facilities associated with semiconductors here to the mainland. And then, of course, we have some of the tax incentives rolled out and enabled by the Inflation Reduction Act, all having a major contribution and factor to what we're seeing in terms of new domestic manufacturing in the United States. If we go to the next slide, we'll take a deeper dive in what we're seeing in terms of the data centers. The illustration on the left really gives you a sense of the sheer volume of data centers that are located in the United States in terms of scale and location, as well as the graph on the right that gives you a sense of what these numbers look in aggregate in terms of overall capacity by each major market in the United States. Obviously, PJM market being one of the highly most impacted areas across the nation. And what's pretty evident to us when looking at this information is that you can clearly see there are major clusters across the United States when it comes to some of these data center facilities. And we're going to highlight 3 just to illustrate this point. And the first one is around the Northern Virginia region. If you look at this, you're basically looking at the largest cluster data center in the world. Just to give you a sense of the overall activity in this region, since 2009, there's been close to just 1 second here, make sure I get my numbers straight. Yeah, there's been a large number of data center for 81 total data center facilities have been connected and currently being served by some of the serving entities in the region. That represents closely to 3.5 gigawatts of additional capacity that's been added to this region. If we move further down south to the Georgia region, we see a big cluster of blue dots in the state. This state is mainly served by the utility Georgia Power, and this activity of all the data centers currently being added to the state, plus some of the planned capacity have caused the utility to revise some of the projected large load demands on a year-over-year basis, going from approximately 100 megawatts of large load demands of every year capacity to close to 2,200 megawatts of additional capacity being added every year to be able to serve this load. Just to put it in perspective, that's close to a significant size power plant being added to the system every year to be able to serve this load. And then last but not least, we can move up to the Pacific Northwest, where we see a big cluster around the Oregon and Washington region. Some of the numbers reported by the Western Electric Coordinating Council has nearly doubled some of the projected forecast demand over the next 10 years to account for a lot of the data center activity in this region. So a lot of activity going on associated with data center. We fully expect that to continue as we move forward and affect some of the markets that are serving these facilities. If we go to the next slide, we can take a deeper look at what's going on with cryptocurrency mining. The map on the right really paints the picture of what we know about some of these cryptocurrency mining facilities in the United States. There are approximately 131 facilities in the United States with only 52 known locations. And for those that follow the cryptocurrency market closely, you've probably heard of some of the recent efforts by the Energy Information Administration to really gather additional information, collect additional information associated with these facilities in terms of footprint and then load consumption. So expect more activity from the Energy Administration, Information Administration when it comes to this regard. And that's really going to further enhance our understanding on the impacts of these facilities have in terms of the different markets that are currently located. Now, what's interesting about some of the cryptocurrency mining facilities is that some of these facilities can actually serve as flexible loads or offer ancillary services to some of the markets that they're currently located at. One example is in the state of Texas. There's a company called Riot Platforms that have several cryptocurrency mining operations in the state. And what they essentially been able to do is been able to pre-negotiate rates to serve that load and lock in electric rates ahead of time. And then when times of high electric demands, whether it's extreme weather conditions, whether it's high heat or extreme cold temperatures, they've been able to sell that capacity back into the state energy market and receive some significant credits into their electric bills. Now, this has been a fairly controversial topic in the state of Texas, but the broader point here is that there's been some benefits that have been able to be extracted in terms to alleviate some of this congestion and system constraint issues associated during peak demand. So if we go to the next slide, here's where we start getting into what has been some of the industry reaction. Now, we won't have time to cover all of these points in details, and of course, the reactions varied across different jurisdictions, market serves, and even policymakers involved. But I will highlight a few of the most recent and interesting ones just to illustrate our point. The first one is around rapid resource deployment. So if we look at all the data center activity that we recently reviewed in one of the prior slides related to the state of Georgia, we've seen how the utility on the state is really working with the regulators to make an exception to the traditional procurement processes to be able to comply and procure timely generation to be able to serve the load, the short-term load associated with large data centers. So really getting creative on what some of the ways that they can quickly deploy generation to be able to serve the load. Another one is around nuclear power considerations. A lot of us have heard the recent news around Amazon and Talon Energy and the co-located data center next to the Susquehanna nuclear plant. And basically they're off-taking 480 megawatts of the capacity, of the output capacity of that nuclear site to serve that data center. And of course, numerous conversations between industry leaders around the DOE and the tech industry in potentially leveraging SMR technology, small nuclear reactor technology, to potentially serve the load of some of these large loads, whether it's data centers or new domestic manufacturing facilities and so forth. And then last but not least, policy adjustments. There's been a few markets that are actually considering rolling back some of the tax incentives that are in place in some of these jurisdictions for some of the data center facilities to help alleviate the scale and the speed that some of these facilities are coming online. So a lot of activity on this space. We fully expect this to continue moving forward and evolve, but this gives you a good summary of what the industry has seen up to this point. And to wrap it up, we want to highlight some key takeaways. So if we go to the next slide, we've identified six. This is not intended to be an all-inclusive list, but really to give the audience here some key considerations as they think through how to manage some of these large loads issues. The first one is really around load planning and load forecasting. And it goes without saying, a lot of utilities are really looking at how they perform these functions, whether they need to take a more holistic approach in integrating generation, transmission, distribution, even the fuel components, to really plan ahead and being able to be in a better position to serve the demands associated with some of these large loads. So really looking at how those components are being currently executed and how do we improve to have a better outcome and plan for these in the future. The second one, it talks about just rapid deployment of generation capacity. We just spoke around the Georgia example, and it's really considering how can we get creative to quickly deploy generation capacity to be able to meet the demands of some of these large load capacity and serve our customers in a safe and reliable manner. The third and fourth one really go hand in hand in terms of really considering the regulatory implications and environmental impacts on some of these large loads in terms of working with our regulators to make sure that we have appropriate solutions in place that will minimize the impact to our customers, as well as keep track of some of our targets in terms of net zero or carbon-free goals that have been set in some of this jurisdiction as we add new load into the system. Then the last two speak about potential revenue generation potential, especially for qualifying utilities that have significant load energy demands over the next coming years. Really striking that balance between the capital investments needed, the impacts to new customers, as well as the impacts to the grid to be able to maximize some of these potential revenue potential. And then last but not least, with any new problem, there's room for innovation. Of course, we see this area as fairly new and with room for opportunity to grow with new innovative solution, creative ideas to help mitigate and solve some of the problems associated with the large loads coming online in the United States. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Kristen to cover our next topic.
All right, thanks very much, Gerardo. Next slide, please. All right, so our next topic is clean heat, and Victoria Nielsen is going to lead that conversation. Victoria is a manager, and she just joined us last year. She's done work in market potential studies and program design projects focused on energy efficiency, demand response, EVs, electrification, and emissions reduction. She's also been involved in some recent clean heat proceedings. So with that, I will turn it over to Victoria.
Thank you, Kristen. So let's get into some clean heat. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. The term clean heat may be a new terminology for some, but it's really been an energy industry movement that's been gaining traction in the last few years. So the term's really focused on the natural gas sector, primarily driven by regulatory and policy shifts aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Here at Scott Madden, we've tried to put some parameters around the term, knowing that it's not black and white. So we view clean heat as the intersection of decarbonization, electrification, and the natural gas utility transformation, meaning changing gas business structure around planning, investments, et cetera. There's a few common catalysts that we've observed from early actors, and that's really been statewide climate legislation, and also initiated through future of gas proceedings, either from the legislation or kind of on their own from regulatory proceedings. And those proceedings are really focused on assessing investments in the gas system that have in some cases resulted in clean heat programs or standards. But at the core, clean heat really pulls from a variety of supply side strategies and demand side strategies to formulate policies and programs that drive emissions reductions. Some of these clean heat efforts are really tapping into these strategies that have been around for decades. So when you're combining them with emerging technologies and strategies like renewable natural gas, it's really creating this interesting dynamic that's been a new challenge for natural gas utilities. And we'll touch on that challenge a little bit today, but it's almost worth its own presentation. So clean heat has been manifesting in many different ways across the US, but it's really no one size fits all. Next slide. And that no one size fits all is really evident in the two states that we'll hit on today on this slide. And the first state that we'll discuss is Colorado. Colorado is taking a more broad approach to clean heat, and that is requiring, the state's requiring the natural gas utilities and the electric utilities to create these clean heat plans. That's requiring them to reduce greenhouse gases by certain percentages over time. And these clean heat plans are including a mix of supply side and demand side resources. And these eligible resources can include energy efficiency, beneficial electrification, recovered methane, green hydrogen, and advanced leak detection and repair above and beyond what they're doing as a requirement for the federal government. In this instance, utilities are pulling together plans that integrate that existing strategies like energy efficiency with new and emerging strategies. And this is a very broad look at different resources, but that broad look is needs to create an incredible amount of coordination across utility business units that haven't traditionally been interacting from a resource planning standpoint. And so that is creating really intense demands on these utilities to be coordinated. The next state that we'll look at is New York. So they're kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum. They're taking a more narrow view of clean heat. While the state is engaged in other clean energy strategies, when we're talking about clean heat specifically, they're taking a narrow view. So clean heat for New York is really meaning utility demand side programs supporting building electrification. And as I mentioned, this is a more narrow focus, and focusing on clean heat technologies that's driving substantial technology adoption. And there's potential for other clean heat policies through a pathway study that's ongoing. But as of right now, clean heat for New York is meaning heat pumps. Both of these progressive states are really driving towards emissions reductions in the natural gas sector, but they're doing it in different ways. Next slide. Now we'll look across the country. So we focused on two opposite ends of the spectrum. So we'll kind of look across the United States to see a broad range of interpretation of what clean heat is. The first category that's in the lighter teal color includes 8 states that have some sort of program or policy that's in place. The next category are future clean heat programs or standards. And this is the darker teal color, and these are 3 states that are actively in the process of finalizing programs or policies. So their next phase is really implementation of those. The next category is potential clean heat programs or standards or policies. And these are really 2 states that are getting ready for potential clean heat policies. And the first is Illinois, which is engaged in a future of gas proceedings that may result in a policy related to clean heat. And then New Jersey, which has had several clean heat related policies come through the state. And finally, in the green are several states that don't have official programs or policies, but offer incentives for clean heat related technologies. So we have New York, California, Connecticut that have focused clean heat programs on heat pumps. And then on the other side, you have Minnesota, Colorado, New Jersey that are potentially looking at a broader range of strategies. So in terms of across the US, it's really very broad in terms of how the different states are interpreting clean heat. Next slide. Now that we've defined clean heat and we've looked at the status of different states, we wanted to outline a few considerations when thinking about clean heat. So the scale and pace of decarbonization and clean heat policies is really still uncertain, but there's a couple of different considerations that we've observed from these early acting states. The first is around balance. So utility commissions are needing to really balance many different priorities across multiple different stakeholders, which is a significant challenge. That's bringing up topics around affordability, reliability, customer choice, integrating politics, and more. That is creating tension where some of them might be in conflict. The second consideration is around timing. So while early action is important for these emerging technologies like renewable natural gas or network geothermal to really clarify how these strategies are going to play a role, that can create some potential tension if we move too quickly. So swift government mandates and restrictions could cause some serious customer pushback if customers are not ready to adopt or utilities are struggling to integrate them. So a more gradual approach in jurisdictions is really demonstrating that that will be effective for success. And the last consideration that I'll highlight here is really around building in flexibility and how that will be important. And whether it's different strategies in terms of supply side and demand side, or building in flexibility around timing in terms of like a staged approach, the regulatory framework is really poised for considerable change. So building in that flexibility to create like transition plans or different policies will help to balance some concerns and ease that pressure. Next slide. So now we're going to dive a level deeper. So we've highlighted some general considerations, and now we'll get into some more specific tailwinds and headwinds. In terms of tailwinds, the first one that I'll highlight is around the unprecedented investment around heat pumps. There's considerable investment in customer incentives for this technology, and it's not likely to slow down. As more states take on that clean heat policy and movement, the industry is really poised to watch how these states develop their policies and then incorporate lessons learned. Because it's happening at a gradual pace, we'll be able to hopefully watch these states develop and take some best practices for the different policies and perspectives. And the last tailwind that I'll highlight is around workforce related to heat pump adoption. There's significant development that's needed to educate and develop the workforce for the accelerated technology deployment. While states have already robust energy efficiency networks for trade allies, because there's such a accelerated adoption that's needed, there's going to be some education and that's needed to develop that workforce more to handle that, how quickly that adoption moves on. And now we'll look at some headwinds. So for the first one, we'll highlight there's some serious opposition that has been seen for clean heat around positioning it as a gas ban, because there's concern that lessening investment in the aging gas system will affect specific industries in the state. It's bringing up some significant concerns and opposition around clean heat and decarbonization, where states are ready to transform. Industries within the states are bringing up some specific concerns around that. The last headwind that I'll highlight is around costs. So clean heat technologies require significant upfront costs from a utility and from a customer standpoint, and that will affect the scale and pace of adoption. Each of these opportunities and risks associated with clean heat can be managed through thoughtful planning and regulation and regulatory discussion. But highlighting these really demonstrates the complexity of clean heat and all the different considerations around clean heat. Next slide. So what's next for clean heat? Well, we're kind of looking at 3 key states, and each of these states are at different stages of their clean heat policy development. The first state is Illinois, and they're really in their investigation stage. They're in the midst of a future of gas workshop that just wrapped up their phase 1 and is aiming to create an action plan by the end of this year that outlines future infrastructure investment plans. The phase 1 has really been just topic gathering, so no formal positions have been shared. That's going to be gathered in phase 2. But one of the interesting notes from these proceedings is that one of the first comments from the ICC, which is the state commission, said that this is not an electrification proceeding. So that was made clear up front, and so we'll see how that plays out with the rest of the workshops throughout this year. The next state that I'll highlight is New Jersey. So I'm calling this in a pre-legislative stage because there's been scattered activity around decarbonization and clean heat in the past year. There's been legislation that's been proposed and then stalled, along with a future of gas technical workshop that was completed in 2023. So they're in a really kind of stop and start phase in terms of clean heat, but that's been gaining momentum. And so it's likely that they'll have a legislation passed within the next year that addresses clean heat. The final state that I'll highlight is Massachusetts. So while New Jersey has had some quick hits of activity, Massachusetts has taken a slower pace. And that's been seen through the future of gas proceedings, which started back in 2020. And they just released their final order around their beyond gas initiatives in December of 2023. So it's taken them a while to get there. But they do have a clean heat standard that's been proposed, and that framework was released at the end of 2023. So it's getting ready for implementation, but is not finalized. So it'll be an important state to watch over the next year as they work through implementation of that clean heat standard. Next slide. And finally, I wanted to highlight some overall key takeaways. You might have observed a theme of my presentation that there's considerable transformation ahead and in the natural gas sector. So taking a more calculated but collaborative approach will be important for any clean heat policy or program. And that really wraps up my clean heat presentation. And thank you all. And now back to Kristen.
All right, thanks very much, Victoria. Next slide, please. All right, so last but not least, we have workforce development. Justin Stevens is going to lead that discussion. Justin is a partner out of our Raleigh office. He's been with us for more than 15 years, and his work has focused on market analysis, transaction support, business planning, cost reduction, and performance improvement. Justin?
All right, thank you, Kristen, and thanks to everybody for joining us. I'm going to be batting cleanup here and talking about our final topic, which is workforce development. We can go ahead and move on to the first slide. So I wanted to start with a couple of macro level points to set some context for this topic. So this page has some economy-wide level data showing trends in the US labor force. The top metric is labor force participation by age group. And what we see here is that there's been a sharp rebound since the pandemic for prime age workers. Those are folks 25 to 54 years old. And that's the purple line on the chart there. So you can see there was the sharp drop in 2020, and then we've steadily rebounded since then to the point that we're now exceeding pre-pandemic levels. And in fact, participation of that age group is approaching highs that we really haven't seen since the early 2000s. And then on the bottom graph, you can see the ratio of job openings to hires. This is a proxy for the average time needed to fill a position. And on that metric, you can see that we're sitting at historic highs that we really haven't seen over the last couple of years here. So we've all heard this anecdotally and we've experienced it with our own hiring, but what this data shows is that attracting and retaining talent is as difficult right now as it's ever been. Next slide, please. The other point of context that I want to make is that this challenge is particularly acute for the energy industry, given what it's trying to accomplish with decarbonization and the changing generation mix and the ongoing energy transition. So on this slide, you can see how utility CapEx has outpaced inflation pretty significantly over the past decade. And that holds true when you break it out by different sectors too. So on the right, you can see electric utilities, gas utilities, multi-utilities, in every case, significantly outpacing inflation. And everything we read in the news every day suggests that this trend is not just continuing, but it's going to accelerate as utilities continue to announce very aggressive CapEx plans. So beyond the labor constraints that we highlighted on the last slide, the utility industry also has to contend with these aggressive growth plans and investing in new technologies that are going to drive demand for labor and for new skills. Next slide. Given these challenges, we were really excited last year to work with the Center for Energy Workforce Development on administering its biannual Energy Workforce Survey. CEWD is a nonprofit consortium of energy companies and other industry participants, and they've conducted this survey every other year since 2006 in order to measure trends in the size, age, demographics, and attrition of the workforce to support industry efforts around workforce planning. CEWD's entire membership is invited to participate, and you can see on the page here who participated in 2023. So we had 40 individual companies, as well as an NRECA submission that represented all of its members. And of the 40 companies, 16 of those had nuclear generation. And you can see on the right, we had a good mix of electric, gas, and combo utilities, some public power, cooperatives, and some independent power producers. The submissions in total represented almost 315,000 jobs, so we believe it was a good cross-section of the industry as a whole. So I'm going to talk today about 3 of the key findings from the 2023 survey, starting on the next slide. Our first key finding is that the age distribution of the workforce has changed pretty dramatically over the period that CEWD has been conducting this survey. So you can see the first chart on the left, millennials now make up the largest portion of the workforce at 38%. I believe this is the first time that that's been the case. And overall, there's a nice distribution of employees by age group. When CEWD first started doing this survey back in 2006, it used to be called the Gaps in the Energy Workforce Survey. And what we saw was a big spike in the number of employees in their late 40s, 50s, and 60s who were moving towards retirement. And then there was a drop off after that of not enough younger employees ready to replace those workers as they retired. So that was the gap that this survey was originally named for. What we see here is that that gap has largely been solved for. Replacing those retirees is no longer as much of a concern. The new challenge that the industry is now faced with is managing this workforce that is much younger and has much fewer years of experience. So you can see that on the second graph on the right-hand side, 56% of all employees have less than 10 years of experience, and nearly 50% of employees in key jobs, and we define key jobs as line workers, technicians, plant and field operators, and engineers. 50% of employees in those jobs have less than 10 years of experience. So those numbers were staggering to me as somebody who's worked in this industry for a long time. And keep in mind the slide I showed a minute ago with the CapEx trends. So this new generation of workers is overseeing a period of massive growth, including, as Gerardo just talked about, load growth. And what this data tells us is that many in the workforce have never seen load growth before, or certainly not to the extent that we're seeing it now. Next slide, please. Our second finding was around growth in emerging technology jobs. So you hear a lot about these new job categories, and we defined emerging tech jobs as solar, wind, storage, and electric vehicle engineers and technicians, as well as data scientists. And what we found was that while these emerging tech jobs still represent a fairly small portion of the workforce overall at just under 3%, it's by far the fastest growing category. So you can see on the top chart in the middle that these jobs more than quadrupled in the 2 years since the 2021 survey, going from 0.6% of the overall workforce to 2.6%. We also found, interestingly, that a majority of these jobs are being filled by employees in mid to late career ages. So that's the top right graph, the blue bars. You can see there that over 60% of those employees are age 38 or older. And we saw a similar pattern when we looked at the same information in terms of years of service. So workers in these jobs tended to be on the higher end in terms of years of service with that company. So what we took away from that is that these companies are not hiring skills to fill those roles, but are relying to some extent, at least, on their existing workforce. And the implication here is that to be successful with that strategy, companies will need to reinvest in reskilling, upskilling, and retraining of their workers. And then on the next slide, the last of the three findings that we'll cover today was around what we're calling a new normal post-COVID. And we've heard a lot about impacts to the workforce from the pandemic, so we wanted to test out if there was anything that we saw in this data set. And while it's probably too early to call this a trend, we do think we have a finding here. So the top chart on this page shows total attrition as a percent of the workforce broken out by retirement and non-retirement attrition. And what we see is a sharp increase in that number in the last 2 years, to the point that 2022 was the highest year on record for both total attrition and non-retirement attrition. And in fact, non-retirement attrition, so this is people who are leaving their current employers for reasons other than retirement, was at 7.2%, which was more than total attrition was back in the early days of this survey. Like I said, it's too early to really call this a trend, and you can see in the 2020 data there, it was significantly lower. So this could be a case of you had more people staying in their roles during the height of the pandemic, and then we've seen a lot of moving around since then. But it is pronounced enough to be worth noting, we think, and it fits with the narrative that we hear of workers leaving jobs or changing jobs more frequently. And then at the bottom of the page, you can see we broke out the same information by function, and you can see that this trend holds for the most part across all these functions except for gas, T&D. This is non-retirement attrition. That was the only one that we saw a decrease over the last 2 years. So an interesting finding here that is worth continuing to track. The implication of this for companies is that they really need to think about how workforce planning needs to adjust to reflect these new post-COVID norms, and potentially a workforce that is leaving their jobs or changing jobs more frequently. And that could mean, an increased focus on employee engagement and new ideas for retaining talent. Next slide. So in response to these challenges, we're hearing from many of our clients that they've launched new workforce strategies and initiatives aimed at addressing all the things that we've talked about here, like hiring, retention, skill development, reskilling, and employee engagement. What we found, though, is that these programs are often developed in silos, and they aren't connected to each other or to an overall business strategy. What we recommend is an integrated approach where the appropriate HR functions are working with the business unit or across business units to develop and execute on a cohesive strategy. This could include a 3-step approach like we show on the page here, starting with a workforce planning exercise to understand how company strategy in the future is going to influence and impact workforce needs, a workforce assessment where you evaluate the current mix of skills and people against those future needs, and then workforce development, which includes all the programs and structures needed to execute the strategy and to manage your employee life cycle. Next slide. And this is the last one for me, just to summarize some of the key takeaways. So the overall state of the labor market combined with utilities' aggressive growth plans is really bringing these workforce constraints or potential workforce constraints into focus. The CEWD data showed us that the specific challenges beyond just growth that the industry is solving for have changed, so that it's no longer just about replacing the aging workforce, and it's now about managing that younger workforce and attracting and retaining the skilled labor needed for the energy transition. So given all of this, we recommend an integrated workforce planning and development approach to ensure that your people are of advantage going forward. And with that, I'll turn it back to Kristen.
Great, thanks very much. Next slide, please. And if I could welcome our other panelists back on screen. Right. So thank you all for your remarks. We have gotten a handful of questions, and I'm going to start off with Gerardo. So Gerardo, one of the things, at least as I've followed the industry, I've heard a lot about the need for additional generation capacity to meet the large loads that you're talking about, but I have heard less about transmission. Can you talk a little bit about the transmission infrastructure that we need to start to accommodate some of these loads?
Yeah, thank you, Kristen. Really good question. And, you know, as you think through the large loads, I think a lot of the discussion around the topic has really centered around additional generation capacity. Given the short-term immediate demands associated with some of these facilities, but I would make the argument that expanding existing transmission infrastructure and bringing exporting power from cheaper, more cleaner regions to serve some of these larger loads could be a more efficient way to meet the demand of these customers. Of course, we know the challenges associated with transmission in terms of the planning and construction cycle, legal and permitting hurdles, as well as some of the disputes among utilities and states to allocate the cost to build new transmission capacity. But at a minimum, we feel like it's starting to get some attention. We saw recently some recent legislation from the Biden-Harris administration around new federal permitting rule is looking to cut times in half for qualifying transmission projects while maintaining some of the same environmental standards. Of course, the proof is in the pudding. See if we can achieve those numbers, but at least we see that there is some immediate attention to talk about transmission and how transmission could potentially serve as another solution to serve some of these large loads.
Yeah, I think we're finding that transmission is going to have to be in the center of the clean energy transition, serving large loads. It's would that it were an easier problem to solve. Thanks for that. So Victoria, as you well know, Excel Colorado just had their clean heat plan approved. Any thoughts on that approval and perspectives?
It's big news. It's the first of its kind in terms of a comprehensive plan. And I think it's interesting to watch how the plan evolved from the original filing through the regulatory process and what it ended up being approved. And what happened really was a doubling down of electrification. So the initial plan didn't include as much electrification as what was finally approved. So I think that's interesting to note. And also there was just a general reduction in investment in the supply side strategies. They were asked to remove a green hydrogen pilot, which was pretty advanced. So it's interesting that what happened was a funneling towards electrification and a reduction of the kind of emerging supply side strategies. So that's a general observation. It was just approved last week, so I still have to get through the 140-page final approval. So
fair enough. Thank you for that. So Justin, as we're thinking about these technology jobs, I was a little bit surprised to hear you talk about it being some of the more senior members of the workforce moving into these positions. Do you think we're going to see a strategy of contracting out some of that work? How do you think that set of jobs is going to emerge in terms of sourcing those resources?
Yeah, well, the survey data showed that it was the fastest growing segment. So clearly some companies at least are choosing to do this internally. I think anecdotally, we hear both from our clients. We've heard some that say, we benefit from using EPCs and contractors to do this work for us and bring leading practices and knowledge from around the industry. We hear others say, if this is going to be core to our business going forward, we want to do that work internally. So right now it's a mix of both. And I think a lot of companies are still trying to figure that out.
All right, so standard, what do we want in-house and versus what do we want out there? And do the contracted resources actually exist? Because everybody
They're going to face the same labor constraints that we showed with the others.
Exactly. Thank you for that. So Victoria, you mentioned that there are a number of states that are looking at this. What do the states that have passed or are considering clean heat have in common? Are there any trends that we should be watching right now?
I think it's pretty early days still. I think it's been a slower transition for a lot of states to address these policies and incorporate these strategies. But I think one observable trend, which we've seen particularly with Colorado, is there's kind of a movement and a focus on heat pump deployment as kind of the main strategy. So that heavy electrification focus is what we're seeing in a lot of policies and a lot of the programs and plans that are addressing clean heat.
Are there any efforts that you're aware of as these proceedings go forward to bring an assessment of the electrical side in to say, if we're going to electrify this much, do we know how that's going to land, or is that kind of the bridge too far at this point?
I think that states are attempting to do that. I think in terms of an integrated assessment, I don't know that I've seen that yet, of the natural gas system and the electric system together. There's been separate assessments, but in terms of them working in tandem and a coordinated assessment, I'm not sure that I've seen that yet.
Yeah, I suspect it's coming. So last question to Gerardo. So what are some of the main factors contributing to what we're seeing in terms of these loads growing in various regions? Are there reasons that utilities are seeing these large loads show up in the South or the Northeast? What are some of those drivers, and why do they matter?
Yeah, there's obviously a lot of information out there in terms of what's driving some of this activity in certain regions, and we particularly got into it in taking a closer look on what's going on in the Northern Virginia region and why that big cluster currently exists. And some of the key findings that we saw based on some of our research were, some of the usual suspects, and some of them are not as evident. So of course, proximity to big cities was a big one. Availability of fiber was another one. And of course, you have price and reliability. There are factors that are baked into the equation, as well as land costs and some of the physical security elements. And then of course, one that also kind of stood out, especially in some of the other markets, was around cooling and cooling temperatures having an impact on cooling costs. So there were some factors that were baked in terms of why some of these regions are seeing a larger cluster when it comes to some of the large load capacity.
Interesting. Yeah, the usual suspects. Well, we are just about at time. With that, I'm going to thank our panelists again. I appreciate you all putting the time into this, and we're going to turn it back over to PJ. If you're interested in our EIU, the QR code is available there, and the additional topics that we covered in this particular edition appear below. Thank you. Sorry to PJ, over to you.
You're fine. You took the words out of my mouth, as a matter of fact. And thank you, panel, for your conversation today. It was fantastic. For our audience, we hope you've enjoyed today's discussion. As you log off, please take a moment, complete our survey, and give us your feedback so we can continue to provide you with quality content. Thank you for attending. This concludes today's presentation.